Story 1. I was at my longtime boyfriend's college reunion. All of a sudden, a beautiful woman came into view, and he got all excited, saying, "Rose? Is that Rose from my class?" She was a former classmate and came over to our group. My ex then put his arm around me and said to Rose, "I had a big crush on you in college. If this one, meaning me, ever gets hit by a car, I'm gonna call you because you're really the one for me." Cue the awkward silence. Suddenly, every red flag I had been ignoring was waving in my face. Thanks, Rose, for suddenly appearing. Without you, I would have endured a horrible marriage and a messy divorce. Story 2. We'll get ice cream later if you just play with her for a little while. She's like that because her mom just died. You won't have to deal with her forever. Her mom said to a girl who I thought was my friend and had appreciated up until that point because she was the only one who, I thought, wanted to play with me after my mom died, even though I would sometimes start crying out of nowhere and had severe anxiety. I was 9 and didn't play with anyone for over a year after this because I assumed I was making people deal with me by being around. Story 3. My granny had dementia. One evening she saw the trailer for the movie Armageddon on TV and thought it was the news. She was in her bed crying while my parents were trying to comfort her, and I overheard her say to my parents, "You need to protect her, me. Go hide and take care of her. She is such a nice little girl. Leave me behind. I'm old. I'll slow you down. Please take her to safety and tell her I love her." I was really moved by that. She was ready to sacrifice herself and face the end of the world alone to keep me safe. Story 4. I kind of struggled in elementary school. It was a Catholic school that charged tuition. One night, I overheard my mother say something like this to my father. "We keep paying all this tuition money for what? For her to be stupid." Story 5. That one is going to be in heat soon. A friend of my grandfather said to him. He agreed. I was 12 and the only thing I was interested in were horses. They were well into their 80s. I felt so disgusted being talked about and viewed like that. Story 6. Accidentally, I saw my dad joking about me and criticizing me in an email to both his and my boss, using the family PC. We worked at the same company for a time. I won't pretend I was perfect, but that hurt quite a bit. A girl I liked in school in the 90s, but hadn't actually met, after seeing my picture, said to my friend, "I wish he looked how he sounded on the phone. He sounded so much better looking on the phone." We had been chatting for a while. She didn't know I could hear her. I felt deeply hurt by that too. Story 7. When I was 12 or 13, I spent a summer with my aunt in another state to give my single mother a break, I guess. Back then, I adored my aunt and just thought it was a fun, exciting summer getaway, like camp or something. My mother was neglectful and extremely abusive. I told my aunt and her boyfriend about things my mom had done over the years, and they listened but never really made any comment. One night, they were on the porch, and I was supposed to be sleeping in a room which had windows that opened onto the porch. I heard my aunt's boyfriend say I was the biggest bullshitter he had ever known. My aunt agreed and said, "Someone needs to keep an eye on that one. She's manipulative as hell." 2 years later, I was in foster care because of the abuse and because my mother simply disappeared. To this day, 30 plus years later, I still think my family holds me responsible somehow. Not that I have spoken to any of them in several years. Story 8. Just happened yesterday. I walked into a boutique, well, more like shuffled into one. An old guy standing outside says, "Ha ha ha, I didn't know they had plus-size clothes here. Also, if she lost some weight, she'd walk better. I have multiple sclerosis, and since I can't move well, I gained weight. I just wanted to get something to feel a little prettier again." After that, I cried all evening. Please do not comment on other people's looks unless you're asked. Also, shout out to Christina Applegate. Story 9. That I wasn't really family because I was a stepkid. My father confessed this had been said by someone in my stepmother's family after I asked why said person was not at my high school graduation. It has since been explained that this is not exactly what was said, and that this was only how my dad took it at the time, and that he was still mad when he explained it to me. But still, at 17, when I was already struggling to figure out who I was, that hurt. And it did a lot of damage between me and my stepmom's family. Story 10. Overheard a conversation between my mom and grandmother when I was a teenager pretending to be asleep. My mom said, "She's so desperate for love and attention. I'm worried she's going to get knocked up or end up with someone bad." My mom literally never said, "I love you" to me in my life. I once asked her for a hug, and she told me she found it disgusting to touch me. I told her I needed to feel loved, and her response was, "I thought you'd have a boyfriend by now." When I overheard that conversation, I wanted to run out of the room and scream in her face. I had been begging her to even slightly fulfill her role as a parent for years, and her takeaway was that I was desperate for attention. Story 11. I jokingly said that I'm pretty and I deserve a handsome man to my mom and uncle. When I left the room, I heard them laughing so loud and mocking me, saying, "She thinks she's beautiful. I don't think she's ever seen her face in a mirror." That was my mom, and it broke me. Story 12. Content warning. The original text contains offensive language and concepts that may be distressing. Here's a revised, respectful version of the text that addresses the request for correction. If I had known about her disability, I might have made a different decision. I'm on the autism spectrum. Many days, I wish for a different reality for myself as well. Story 13. When I was a teenager, my dad and mom were divorced for the second time, and I was not able to maintain a healthy communication with either. I always thought they loved me, but they just did not know how to communicate. I was living with my dad, and his wife disappeared for over a week. My dad never said anything to me, but I knew something was fishy. One day, I secretly went through his messages to understand what was happening, and I found a message from his wife. Turns out she left the house because I invited my friends to stay during the weekend when they were away. Along the messages, she referred to me as the boy no one accepted and got stuck with them. She said things that were not real, such as me causing endless problems in the house. Due to my childhood traumas, I never expressed dissatisfaction or demanded anything, and I was an extremely introverted, almost never speaking guy. I almost never communicated with them. My dad never denied in his messages and even implied that he was agreeing with her. They later made peace somehow and she returned home, but I left the house soon after because I knew I was the biggest burden in their family. Story 14. I joined stage crew at my school, and after a year I ended up being good enough to earn the title of head after a lengthy assessment and interview process. The second I got the lead role, I couldn't figure out why things weren't working for me. I could never get software to work on time or find people to help build set designs. Teachers were constantly annoyed because I hadn't met deadlines, but I'd never even known about them. Eventually, a friend came up to me with a recording. He was trying to get something for a video diary and ended up catching background noise. My fellow stage crew members were laughing about how terrible I was, saying I was a selfish, incompetent person. I didn't deserve my title. I won't go into details, but it was a 33-minute recording. They detailed how they were purposefully ruining software, not turning up to meetings and then doing the tasks wrong so that I looked bad, miscommunicating with teachers so I looked incompetent and then laughed about it behind my back. For 33 minutes. So many hurtful words from people I thought I was on good terms with. I stopped listening after 17 minutes because it was that painful. My teacher ended up kicking me out of stage crew after another student heard what they were doing and reported them. Not because she thought I was incompetent too, but there were more of them than there were of me, and it was more efficient if I left, her words. It's been 6 months since I lost my favorite ever hobby, and I still don't know why they did it, or why they wouldn't talk to me if they genuinely thought I was that bad, or even why they felt the need to ruin all my work so I looked bad. I cried for a week straight. Story 15. I was a server in a restaurant, and we made a significant mistake. This was in Times Square, in a packed restaurant full of tourists who needed to make it to their Broadway shows on time, and our kitchen was overwhelmed. Nothing was coming out on time. Simple appetizers and salads took an hour to reach the table, and the customers were understandably upset. Management was not on the floor because they were all in the kitchen, yelling at the cooks to work faster. One of my tables, 2 women and 2 preteen girls, had enough and had to leave quickly to make their show. They left, but not before expressing their frustration loudly at me. One of the girls caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry," as her mother was scolding me. The mother then took her aside, and as I walked past, I heard her saying, "Don't ever apologize to someone in service." And the girl was crying. I felt terrible for the girl, and it was just so dehumanizing for me. Like, sure, don't apologize to me in this instance, I understand. But to suggest never apologizing to anyone in service? What is so wrong with us? Story 16. My childhood was spent more or less ignored by my father. After he died, my best friend since high school told me she had always assumed he was a stepdad based on how he treated me. One weekend when I was in my 20s, my adopted sister came back to town. We all went out for food and drinks. Myself, her, and my dad. Someone from his work came up to us. Motioning toward my sister, he asked if she was my dad's daughter. Jesus Christ, it's been years and this still stings. My father turns to the guy and says, "Are you kidding me? Like I could ever have a daughter that beautiful." Nearly in tears, I booked it to the bathroom. As soon as the feeling of wanting to throw up left, I went home. I saw my dad the next day and he was oblivious. He had no idea why or when I left. I confronted him a few days later and he got upset with me. He told me it was self-deprecating humor and that I was being childish. Man, I don't care if your daughter has a Quasimodo hump and warts all over her face. Never, ever say in front of her that she's not beautiful. Story 17. That I was broken. I had just had my 6th miscarriage. My father-in-law said it to my stepmother-in-law, not realizing I was standing behind them. Stepmother-in-law made a quip that even the 2 kids my husband and I do have aren't okay. Our son has an autoimmune disease, and that she wasn't surprised because I'm such terrible breeding stock. Nothing was more satisfying than my husband yelling at them and explaining to them that he is the carrier for this disease and it comes from his dad. Story 18. My wife was telling her sister recently that I had been crying like a little child. I had been, but it totally changed my view of her. She has always been kind of cold, but that was a new low and it hurt. I was and still am going through a pretty rough patch in life, and she was essentially making fun of me for it. Story 19. When my uncle said I couldn't finish the degree program that I've chosen since it was difficult and I am not that smart, but who cares? I graduated with top honor. Story 20. I want to send some love out there to everyone here because you guys, wow. We, as humans, really need to start being better to each other. My story. I was homeless as a teenager, so was my dad. At one point, instead of payment for his work on an empty house, his boss let us sleep in it on the floor. Since my dad wasn't being paid, we couldn't buy any food. So a couple of my friends offered to feed me a few times. I refused, and then I'd ask if they were sure if they insisted multiple times every time, and they always insisted and wouldn't stop until I ate. Then, I heard one of them say how they wished I didn't eat their food. They were sick of it. They also still offered and pushed it on me after that, and I refused, never told them I knew what they said. Also, I stopped accepting food from anyone, period, for a really long time. Story 21. In high school, one of my best friends I grew up with told another friend that people who looked like me didn't belong in the high-class mall we were going to go to, and he was embarrassed to be seen with someone who dressed the way I did, which admittedly wasn't cool for the year 2000. All black, trench coat, band t-shirts, long hair, that kind of thing. He was as preppy as they come. I stopped being his friend when I heard, and I still won't be his friend 20 years later. I even tried to forgive him and add him on Facebook, but he ran his mouth again, and that was that. Story 22. I accidentally read a message from my wife saying, "I've resigned myself to my husband because I couldn't find anyone better." It was like a stab in the heart, and now I just don't know what to do. Feels like my whole life has been one big lie. Story 23. If I had known how bad his home life was at school, I would have been nicer to him. Overheard that said by a person I worked with when I was a student who had been at school with me. I wasn't heartbroken or upset. I was just extremely angry. You shouldn't have to know how tragic someone's background is to justify being nice or being civil to someone. Just be. Story 24. My now ex-wife said to my face, "I never loved you. I was just in a bad spot in my life and knew if I married you, you would pay for my college, and I could either fall in love along the way or just divorce you after." For context, I'm pretty sure she intentionally tried to pass on an STD from her affair partner so she could paint me as the one being unfaithful. I followed her comment up by saying, "Wow, I didn't think you'd come right out and admit to the whole being a gold digger." To which she replied, "I knew you would accuse me of being a gold digger, and I was not because I really tried to actually love you." Story 25. I was struggling in my first job role after being unemployed for several months during the lockdown. I saw one of my colleagues sending another colleague a Teams message saying, "How did such a moron convince us to hire him?"